So, another concept or principle that has been important to me through the work with Continuum is the idea of sounding and what's possible through that. And for me, I've absolutely had the experience in looking at cymatics and all sorts of pieces where, yes, absolutely, sound affects matter and our bodies have matter. And so, of course, it makes sense that adding sound into the exploration could be this really important part of meeting the tissues and creating movement in the body. But also that we can use sound as a tool to direct the attention of the mind. And that has been incredibly powerful and important to me because I am someone who really can get into the hamster wheel of my mind and it can run away with me and sometimes just doing the imagining of something inside my body or a mental exploration or even bringing in touch helps certainly, but there's something about sound that can, and directing my attention with sound, that can interrupt that hamster wheel so I can actually have a focus and a way to direct more specifically. So that's been hugely important.
And have there been particular sounds that you felt have been most helpful for you or most helpful at particular times?
Yes. I'm smiling because I'm debating about whether to go here with one. But I think they all have different capabilities at different times. And sometimes I find that that just the application is useful in different ways at different points and times. One that I've used kind of in my everyday life more regularly, and this was what I was debating talking about, is the lunar breath. So that's not, an audible sound so much, but I've really used the lunar breath to help dissipate moments, times of intensity. And for me, it helps me to go into the dissolve a bit. And particularly, I've used the lunar breath as a form of sedation when I have to go into the hospital periodically and I get PICC lines. So that it starts at my arm, the insertion starts at my arm and it goes up into my heart. And oftentimes now these days, I've started them when I was very young, but these days they often recommend you get sedated going in and not full put under general anesthetic, but IV sedation so that you can kind of handle it because you need to be awake and you need to move your head in certain ways so it doesn't go up into your heart and all sorts of things. But I've chosen to use the lunar breath instead, for example. So going into the room all gowned up and things, and I sort of pick a focus. I feel my body on the table, and then I use the lunar breath to create space in my system and work with the intensity of what's happening. And so that's one situation, but there's many situations where I use it if I'm feeling geared up or anxious, nervous about something. I'll often tap into the lunar as a tool for that. And I've actually used the lunar breath for when I've had bleeding from my lungs. And one example of this was I was actually in the middle of a virtual with Emily on the phone with a group of people. And I started to have a bleed from my lungs. And what happens when that happens is I actually start coughing up blood, and it's pretty scary. It can be life threatening. I've had bigger episodes and smaller episodes, but this was kind of a little bit of a smaller one. And I thought, oh God, no, not now. Why now? Please don't do this now. And so what I decided to do in that moment, and there wasn't a full decision process. It was just kind of what I moved into at that point as I started to work with the lunar breath. And I had this, and it was held in the field. I couldn't be in a more perfect place. And I had this experience of actually having gills and the knowingness of how a fish can breathe through the fluid of the water. And using the lunar breath, I was able to have that experience. And it was like I could breathe through the fluid in my lungs as a fish would with their gills, breathing through the fluid of the water. And it really was the lunar breath, and just that maybe it was a tissue memory of using it before, but it really was the lunar breath that helped me. And again, these were split second decisions in the moment, but it really helped. And the bleeding stopped. I was able to complete that dive, and I got the care I needed afterwards. But it was a remarkable experience of knowing how to breathe through fluid, and the lunar is part of what got me there.
Yes, it is remarkable. And for people who might listen to this, who are not very familiar with Continuum, you describe what the lunar breath is.
Sure. Yes. So the lunar breath is actually one of the hardest ones to teach online without being close to the other so you can really hear it. It can be a little bit tricky to hear. But essentially, there's a couple of ways to come into the lunar breath. One way is if you begin with a hum, an audible hum. So, I don't know, could you hear the hum with this mic? Okay. And then if you sit with that for a few minutes, and then the next step is to let yourself have the hum, but take the vocalization away. So, So I don't know if you can hear that with the mic, but what ends up happening is there's like this, it's almost like, when you hold a seashell up to your ear and you hear the sound of the ocean and the seashell, that is kind of like what comes through when you take the vocalization away with the hum. And as you're doing that, you can also just start to soften your upper palate. And it adds a softness into the experience. Letting the throat be nice and soft is really helpful for the lunar. But just imagining too, as you're making the sound, it's almost like this is kind of what happens spatially. It's a very spacious, softening sound and breath in my experience.
Thank you. I felt some of that as you were doing it, and this gesture really helped. I felt my own throat softening in response.
That's great.
And are there any other sounds in particular you'd like to speak to, or principles, or
Yeah, so I don't think in particular another sound at this point, because I feel like they can all be used so differently. But we could talk about that for a long time. Uh, but I do want to name, I think maybe the last principle I want to name is the piece around micro movements. And this was a concept that was new to me with Continuum. And it was Priscilla who introduced micro movements to me. But this idea that, oh, I get excited just thinking about it. This idea that, let's say you're stepping into or you're exploring with some micro movements with the hand, and that you could back up before these larger movements that we're so used to making, that you could actually back up into the potential of the before that larger movement, to feel into the subtleties of what could be possible before that bigger movement, and that doing so can open up our nervous system to these new possibilities, new resources that we would miss if this was all we knew about the movement of our hand. And that as I open into that, So I'm opening to smallest little micro movements in my fingers, hands, and palm right now. And if I listen and feel for where that travels to, I can feel something in the front of my forearm here, just the tiniest beginning to open in my elbow. And, I could keep going with this for a long time. It's hard to stop once you come in, but I feel like micro movements have this ability to bring us into right this very moment of now and really help us to tap in and feel what's actually happening in my tissue and what's actually possible. And that through doing something so, so simple and so, so small, we have this incredible capability to open up our whole being. I could open up my pelvic floor by opening up something in my baby toe or even my pinky, or that I might learn some new way to breathe by experiencing an opening in my palm or my lips. I mean, that is so extraordinary to me. And it's something that anybody can do at different areas. Even if they can't work with one area of their body, they could experiment with some other piece somewhere else. And it's so subtle, but so incredible in its potential for opening and knowing and nourishing and newness. I'll bring my hand back.
No, it's lovely. When you say opening, could you describe a little bit more when you experience that opening within yourself, what that viscerally feels like? How do you, for example, know you're opening? What is opening
Mm-hmm.
physically?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, for me, the experience of opening, particularly through micro movements, it's like I'm following this thread of trying to think a different word or a different way of describing the opening, but it's like I notice this new space inside myself somewhere. So again, if I'm working with the hand, I just started doing a little tiny bit along this thumb. So I'm noticing there's a new space here. And then I follow the thread of where that new space might also want to open to. I'm just paying attention. And so I'm tracing my finger right now. I'm feeling it a little bit in through the wrist, and then sometimes all of a sudden there will be this, and that thread might open up into a spaciousness or a sense of possibility deeper down into, the arm, and sometimes it's just paying attention so thoughtfully, specifically, and discovering that there's this new movement. And that in itself is also an opening. So I think for me, it's a kind of a combination of those two experiences and just really intimately, intimately paying attention with my body. And this is an opportunity to know my body most intimately right now. And in tomorrow, it could be completely different. But to really have intimacy with what this is right now in a small but profound way.
Yes, with this incredible mystery.
Yes.
Yeah, that we are.
Yes.